So hello fellow Earthlings, this is Earthling 6455463728, and Joe Rogan's guest, Ben Shapiro, he doesn't believe that systemic racism exists. I don't know if he thinks that it never existed, but he thinks that it doesn't exist. I don't think this is too much of a surprise because he is a Republican and he is a well-known right-wing talking person. He has several books, stuff like that. From my perspective, though, I'm wondering how come the things that systemic racism seems to have wanted to achieve, such as segregation, such as racial profiling, such as incarceration, unemployment, higher rates of many of these things for minorities, is consistently being achieved across the United States without some form of systemic racism. With respect to guns and gun violence, black people are supposed to be disproportionate victims at the hands of the police. He doesn't think that that's an issue. He doesn't think that that's real. It's funny. I'm going to take a slight segue, and I'm just going to say that it's my realization or belief now at this point that anybody talking about guns, it's a pointless conversation. And what I mean by it is, if you think that there are too many guns, well, yeah, maybe there are too many guns. But if you really are, hey, we need to tighten up on who owns guns. The number of people who are killed by guns every year in the US, 33,000, is about the same number of people who get killed by traffic accidents every year. And 2/3 of the people who get killed by guns every year are killing themselves. So I think it's a minor issue, especially as compared to the number of people who get killed by cigarette smoking every year, and nobody really seems to care about that. It's like almost 500,000 people get killed by cigarette smoking every year, and the opioid epidemic is a big deal. Even though I think 73,000 people got killed by opioids last year, as opposed to 500,000 people, and people think that that's a thing, and they watch that in the news, and yeah, I think it's silly. And I think people who want to buy a gun to protect themselves in light of those facts, the number of people who get killed by guns, I think they're also equally as ridiculous. So if Ben Shapiro is in the camp of, hey, we need our guns, I think he's ridiculous. And I think that Joe Rogan is ridiculous having a gun for that purpose in light of the number of people who are killed or even shot in the US every year because of that. Just ridiculous. On another note, like I said, even though everything that systemic racism probably would have wanted to achieve is still being achieved, Mr. Shapiro doesn't think that it exists anymore. Now I'm confused as to why it would have disappeared if it did exist, because Jim Crow laws existed, correct? So, and they wanted segregation. They wanted, black this and white that, and obviously black people weren't allowed to vote. Other markers as well, black people, okay, the Civil Rights Act was passed and black people were allowed to vote more easily because they were always allowed to vote, somebody might say. But because of Jim Crow and because of these tests that you had to pass in order to vote, black people are allowed to vote in the South, which since they're a minority, kind of doesn't matter too much. But yeah, they are allowed to vote in the South, and they are more represented in officials when you look at like mayors in certain areas. So that's definitely a great thing. But since they're allowed to vote and they're more represented, I guess that's what Mr. Shapiro would say. Hey, there's no systemic racism. Look at all these changes. But yet black unemployment is consistently higher, like double the rate for white Americans. I think poverty rate is consistently higher, double the rate for white Americans. Incarceration is at 3 times their representation in the population. As a matter of fact, 70% of the people in jail are either black or Hispanic. that seems like it's a result of systemic racism, racial profiling. We know that that still goes on, but that isn't systemic racism. That's a couple bad cops, is it? But for whatever reason, there was a cop that I saw not recently, I saw him again recently, who said that when he was assigned to the white neighborhood, he couldn't make his quotas anymore. So what he would do was go a couple blocks over and pick up, a black person in the black area for anything. He said it didn't matter. He said you can't literally drive a car from A to B legally, given all of the different requirements, I guess, that you would have to have. He's admitting that there's some kind of racism in the system, these quota systems, that police can use or are forced to do things that end up being racist in order to make their quota system. But Ben Shapiro doesn't think that it exists. When it comes to the last mortgage crisis, black people ended up losing most of the gains that they made since the Civil Rights Act with respect to housing, because they were targeted for subprime loans, these high interest loans, these variable interest rate loans. And people might say, well, it is because they signed up for it. It's their fault. Well, none of the people that went to some of these people, you could say they attacked them. They targeted black communities for these loans. I'm sure the black people didn't go out thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to make a lot of money. And because it's really strange that in white areas, they didn't think that they could make a lot of money and go and get these loans. And we know of people in the industry who went looking in black neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods to get people to take these loans. They made a lot of money doing it. They're not in prison, and minority and black home ownership has suffered as a result of that and has not recovered since the Great Depression. So it's interesting that everything, and segregation, yes, the law says that you can't ban black people from black students from schools with white students, but by redistricting and by a number of other means, I presume the fact that black people can't get loans, proper loans, or they get higher interest rate loans, and even some of those other loans that we were talking about, these predatory loans that don't enable them to be able to make these home purchases that they would need in order to be in a richer, whiter area. And still, Mr. Shapiro would say that this is not as a result of systemic racism. We know that black people, based on their skin tone, can expect a different sentence from a white person. The darker you are, the longer your sentence is likely to be. But this, I guess, is a result of bad judges, not as a result of systemic racism. And of course, with respect to education and unemployment figures, Mr. Shapiro blames the fact that there are fewer males in the home. And it's funny because they always tell you that correlation is not causation, and those things correlate. But somehow Mr. Shapiro is of the professional ability to determine that that's the cause of the problem. It's not because of low property values and subsequently substantially lower amounts of funds to educate people in black areas. There was one person who was on Joe Rogan's show, Coulion Noir, and he was saying that he was lucky because he went to a very good school, a white school. And he just happened to be lucky to attend that school because of the area that he was in. And he was raised by a single mother, but he turned out to be a lawyer. Now, at this point, Mr. Shapiro would be suggesting that that's anecdotal evidence. That's just one guy who happened to be in a good school system with a single mother who turned out just fine. He applies this anecdotal idea to the overrepresentation of black people amongst people who were short. And I guess he would also put this the lack of fathers in the home. The problem is that when you combine the fact that racial profiling continues, and okay, you don't want to say that it's as a result of systemic racism. It's just bad cops, I guess. And then you combine higher sentences, longer sentences, actually even mandated longer sentences for crack and cocaine. I think it was 200 times longer for the same amount of crack or cocaine. Obama passed some legislation that reduced that, at least on the federal level, not on the local level, on the federal level, I would imagine, to reduce the difference to be 11 times higher for crack cocaine, possessing it, as opposed to cocaine. And we know that black people would have crack, and we know that black and white people are more likely to have cocaine. And we also know that they're almost exactly the same substance. And yet, this isn't systemic racism, this sentencing. We know that there's higher sentences for crack cocaine. Now, Joe Rogan did push back against Ben Shapiro, but for one thing, he doesn't have that experience. He's not a lawyer. He's not versed in any of these things. So he was stumped on one or two occasions. And a few occasions, I guess he did manage to say, that doesn't make sense, Ben. But on other occasions, with respect to, what's his name? To Colin Kaepernick, he was stumped. But at least he did try. Maybe Colion Noir and other of his guests may have educated a little bit enough to be able to say, no, Ben, that doesn't make any sense. And, any person might not have been able to say what they needed to say at the time. But I guess at least he tried. So anyway, guys, you can wish me luck. You can like or unlike, comment, subscribe, and or share. And won't like it, but I'll have to take it. You can do nothing. Peace.